Bath, spring of 1817. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the assembly rooms, casting long shadows across polished floors where the fashionable world of Bath congregated to see and be seen. Miss Cordelia Talbot stood near the carved marble fireplace, her modest gown of pale blue muslin marking her as gentry rather than aristocracy, her eyes following the movements of a particular gentleman with an intensity she would have been mortified to have observed. At 19, Cordelia possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, like the opening of a rare folded blossom. Her aunt, the formidable Mrs. Helena Cavendish, had made it abundantly clear that with a dower of merely £2,000 and no family connections of consequence, Cordelia's prospects were limited at best. Her aunt's words clawed at her conscience daily, a litany of disappointment that had shaped her understanding of her own worth. Yet the Honorable Gideon Sinclair, youngest son of the Marquis of Wolverhampton, had been seeking her company for 8 weeks now. 8 weeks of clandestine conversations and increasingly intimate correspondence that made her heart race with possibilities she had never dared imagine. 8 weeks of believing that perhaps, just perhaps, she might be the exception to every rule her aunt had taught her about the vast distance between their stations. If stories of love that challenges society's cruelest boundaries move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Gideon had promised to call upon her aunt today, to make his intentions clear, to ask permission to court her formally. 2 months of secret meetings in the circulating library, of notes passed through servants, of promises whispered in shadowed alcoves, were about to transform into something real and acknowledged. "You appear flushed, Cordelia," her aunt observed, with characteristic sharpness, as they returned to their lodgings on Gay Street. "I do hope you are not developing a fever. I cannot afford another physician's bill." "I am quite well, Aunt," Cordelia replied, though her hands trembled as she removed her spencer. The modest sitting room of their rented apartments seemed to close in around her as she waited, watching the mantel clock with an intensity that made each minute feel like an hour. 5 o'clock came and went. Then 6. Her aunt settled into her usual evening routine with barely concealed satisfaction, as if she had anticipated this disappointment all along. "I expect Mr. Sinclair has remembered his station," Mrs. Cavendish remarked as she took up her needlework. "Young men of quality often amuse themselves with girls of modest circumstances, Cordelia. You would do well to remember that before you set your cap at someone so far above your reach." The words landed like physical blows, each one finding its mark in the tender places of Cordelia's heart. She simply nodded and retreated to her small chamber, where she sat by the window overlooking Gay Street, watching carriages pass in the gathering dusk, none of them stopping at their door. The letter arrived the following morning, delivered by a liveried servant whose very presence drew curious stares from neighboring lodgers. Cordelia recognized Gideon's hand immediately, that bold, confident script that had filled her with such hope over the past 2 months. "My dearest Cordelia," it began, and her heart leapt before the words that followed crushed it entirely. "Circumstances beyond my control require my immediate departure for London. Family obligations demand my attention, matters of the utmost importance that cannot be delayed. I shall write again soon. Your devoted G.S." Devoted. The word mocked her from the page. No mention of calling upon her aunt, no explanation for his absence yesterday, no promise of when he might return. Just vague reassurances wrapped in the language of affection that now seemed hollow as a deserted chapel. Yet Cordelia clung to those words with desperate faith. Surely he would write again. Surely his feelings were genuine. He had spoken of love, of a future, of defying convention for her sake. Such declarations could not be false. The days that followed brought an unexpected shift in Cordelia's carefully ordered world. 2 weeks passed with no further correspondence. Cordelia searched the circulating library daily, hoping for a message left with the proprietress, as Gideon had done before. Nothing came. She frequented the pump room during the fashionable hours, thinking perhaps he had returned without sending word. He had not. Her aunt watched these futile efforts with barely concealed vindication, making cutting remarks about foolish girls who believed themselves special when they were but fleeting amusements. Each barb found its mark, settling like a crushing weight in her heart, weighing her down with shame and dawning realization. By the 6th week, Cordelia's monthly courses, always regular as clockwork, failed to arrive. She told herself it was merely anxiety, the strain of waiting and hoping. By the 8th week, when her stays began to feel uncomfortably tight and a wave of nausea sent her rushing from the breakfast table, she could no longer deny the truth that was reshaping her body and her entire future. She was with child, Gideon Sinclair's child, and Gideon Sinclair was nowhere to be found. The realization brought a curious clarity, the kind that comes when the worst possible outcome transforms from abstract fear into concrete reality. Cordelia stood before her small mirror in the chamber she rented with her aunt's grudging allowance, pressing her hands against the subtle swell of her abdomen, and understood with perfect certainty that her life as she had known it was over. She wrote to Gideon that night, her hand steady despite the terror that clutched at her throat. The letter was carefully worded, speaking of consequences and responsibilities, of promises made and the need for their swift fulfillment. She included the direction in Bath where he might send his reply, and she posted it herself, walking alone to the receiving office because she could not bear her aunt's scrutiny. Then she waited, and received no reply. A second letter followed 3 weeks later, more desperate in tone, then a third. By September, when the summer heat gave way to autumn's first cool breath, Cordelia had sent 5 letters and received not a single word in return. Her condition could not be hidden much longer. The swell of her belly, though still modest beneath her high-waisted gowns, would soon become impossible to conceal. Her aunt had begun making sharp comments about Cordelia's increased appetite and tendency toward afternoon naps, observations that felt like nooses slowly tightening around her throat. Cordelia made her decision with the same clarity that had marked her initial realization. She would go to London. She would find Gideon's family residence, and she would demand he honor his promises. The last of her mother's jewelry, a pearl bracelet, and matching eardrops, would pay for the journey and lodgings. After that, she refused to contemplate what might happen next. The coach journey to London took 2 miserable days, during which Cordelia's pregnancy made itself known through persistent nausea and aching fatigue. She arrived at the coaching inn near Piccadilly with barely enough coin left to hire a hackney to convey her to the address she had memorized from Gideon's letters. Wolverhampton House stood in Grosvenor Square, an imposing structure of pale stone and gleaming windows that seemed designed to intimidate those who approached its doors. Cordelia climbed the steps on trembling legs, her modest traveling dress marking her as someone who did not belong in such surroundings. The butler who answered her knock took in her appearance with a single sweeping glance that communicated volumes about her unsuitability. "I must speak with Mr. Gideon Sinclair," Cordelia said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "It is a matter of the utmost urgency." "Mr. Sinclair is not in residence," the butler replied with the particular brand of courtesy that was more cutting than rudeness. "He departed for the continent 3 days past and is not expected to return for 6 months or more." The words hit Cordelia with the force of a physical blow. 6 months. She would be delivered of her child before Gideon even set foot again in England. Her vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges as the full horror of her situation crashed over her. "Perhaps I might leave a message," she managed to whisper, though she knew with absolute certainty that any message she left would be ignored as thoroughly as her letters had been. "You may leave your card," the butler said, though his tone suggested he expected no such thing from someone dressed as she was. Cordelia had no card to leave. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, 3 shillings in her reticule, and a child growing in her womb whose father had abandoned them both without a backward glance. She turned from Wolverhampton House's gleaming steps and walked back into the London streets, understanding at last the full measure of her ruin. The journey back to Bath depleted her remaining resources entirely. Cordelia arrived at her aunt's lodgings with empty pockets and a story prepared about visiting an old school friend, a fabrication so transparent that her aunt's knowing smirk confirmed she had been seen through immediately. "So, he has cast you aside," Mrs. Cavendish said without preamble the moment Cordelia crossed the threshold. "I wondered how long it would take you to chase after him like a fool. Did you imagine he would marry you, child? Did you truly believe yourself so singular?" Cordelia could not speak. Shame and fear held her silent. She simply nodded and retreated to her chamber, where she remained for 3 days, emerging only when her aunt's threats to summon a physician forced her hand. The months that followed were a special kind of purgatory. Cordelia's condition became increasingly difficult to hide as autumn gave way to early winter. Her aunt, displaying a cruelty that surpassed even her usual coldness, forced Cordelia to wear her tightest stays and restricted her meals to the bare minimum under the guise of concern for Cordelia's health. "You are growing quite stout," Mrs. Cavendish would remark at dinner, even as Cordelia pushed food around her plate with a hunger that gnawed at her constantly. "Perhaps we should reduce your portions. I cannot afford to keep a glutton." By November, Cordelia understood that she would receive no help from her aunt, no compassion, no assistance. She sold the last of her possessions, a small locket that had belonged to her mother, for enough coin to perhaps secure passage on a mail coach to some distant town where she might disappear entirely, invent a dead husband, and try to build some kind of life from the wreckage Gideon had made of her future. She was making these desperate plans, 5 months gone with child and watching her meager resources dwindle to nothing when fate intervened in the most unexpected manner. The pump room on a cold November morning was less crowded than during the height of the season, populated mostly by Bath's permanent residents and those seeking the waters for genuine health concerns rather than social display. Cordelia had come because it was warm and because her aunt had ordered her out of the lodgings for the morning, a petty cruelty disguised as concern for fresh air. She stood near one of the columns, feeling the familiar wave of dizziness that had plagued her throughout her pregnancy when her vision began to fade at the edges. She reached for the column to steady herself, but her hands found only air as her knees buckled beneath her. Strong hands caught her before she struck the floor, lowering her carefully as a deep voice called for assistance and water. Cordelia surfaced from the gray fog of near unconsciousness to find herself cradled against a gentleman's chest, his face swimming into focus above her with features that made her heart stop for an entirely different reason. He looked remarkably like Gideon. The same dark hair, the same strong jaw, the same aristocratic bearing. But where Gideon's eyes had held warmth and charm, this man's gaze was cool and assessing, and lines of character marked his face with the stern etching of command, speaking of years and experience Gideon had not yet acquired. "When did you last eat?" the gentleman asked without preamble, his tone making the question an accusation. "I beg your pardon," Cordelia replied, forcing a fragile smile. "I am quite well, merely a momentary faintness." "You are clearly unwell," he replied, refusing to release her even as he guided her to a nearby chair. "And unless I am much mistaken, you are also with child and in a poor state of nourishment. I shall summon a physician immediately." "No," Cordelia said sharply, alarm cutting through her weakness. "No physician. I cannot afford such an expense, and I need no examination to tell me what I already know." The gentleman studied her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into her seat. Then his gaze sharpened with recognition that sent ice through her veins. "We have met before," he said slowly. "Last spring, briefly, at the assembly rooms. You were in the company of my cousin, Gideon Sinclair." The world tilted again, though this time Cordelia remained conscious. She stared at the man before her, seeing now the family resemblance that was unmistakable once acknowledged, understanding that fate had placed her directly in the path of someone connected to the man who had destroyed her. "I am Dominic Sinclair, Earl of Greystone," he continued, his voice dropping to a tone meant for her ears alone. "And I believe you and I have matters of consequence to address, Miss Talbot." The fact that he knew her name, that he had remembered their brief introduction months ago, should have been flattering. Instead, it filled Cordelia with a dread so profound she could barely draw breath. Whatever Lord Greystone wished to discuss, she knew with absolute certainty that it would alter the already ruined course of her life even further. Lord Greystone did not wait for her agreement. He summoned a servant with a gesture that spoke of lifelong authority, ordered a substantial meal brought to a private parlor, and then assisted Cordelia to her feet with a firmness that made refusal impossible. "I will not be seen closeted with a gentleman," Cordelia protested weakly, though she knew her reputation was already beyond saving. "It would not be proper." "I believe we are well past concerns of propriety," Lord Greystone replied with brutal frankness. "And I have no intention of discussing family matters in a public room where every ear in Bath will strain to overhear." The private parlor he secured was modest but respectable, and he did the courtesy of leaving the door ajar by several inches, a gesture toward respectability that would have been touching had the situation been any less dire. The meal arrived with impressive speed, and Lord Greystone waited in silence until Cordelia had consumed enough bread and cold meat to satisfy him that she was not about to faint again. Only then did he speak, and his words were as direct as his earlier question about food. "When did Gideon abandon you?" The bluntness of it, the assumption that she had been abandoned rather than merely unfortunate, brought tears to Cordelia's eyes that she had been too proud to shed even in her darkest moments alone. "He left Bath in May," she whispered. "He promised to call upon my aunt, to make his intentions known. Instead, he sent a brief letter from London and then never wrote again." "And the child?" "Is his," Cordelia said, lifting her chin with what little dignity remained to her. "I was a fool, my lord, but I was not a wanton. There has been no other." Lord Greystone's expression did not soften, but something in his eyes suggested this was not news that surprised him. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming once against the arm in a gesture that might have indicated thought or barely controlled anger. "This is not the first time Gideon has engaged in such behavior," he said finally, his tone flat with disgust. "There was a situation 2 years ago in Yorkshire that required substantial payment to resolve. My uncle, his father, dismissed it as youthful indiscretion. I did not." The knowledge that she was not Gideon's first victim should have brought some comfort, some sense of shared experience. Instead, it made Cordelia feel even more foolish, even more naive. How many letters had Gideon written, filled with the same pretty words he had penned to her? How many promises had he made and broken without consequence? "I have written to him 5 times, Cordelia heard herself say, the confession spilling out despite her shame. "I went to London in September to Wolverhampton House. The butler informed me Gideon had departed for the continent and would not return for 6 months or more. I have nowhere to turn, Lord Greystone. My aunt despises me, I have no other family, and I sold the last of my possessions weeks ago. In another month, perhaps 2, my condition will be impossible to hide, and then I shall be ruined entirely in the eyes of society." "You are already ruined," Lord Greystone said, and though the words were harsh, his tone held no judgment. "The question now is, what measures might be taken to mitigate the consequences?" Cordelia laughed, a sound that held no humor. "There are no measures, my lord. I am with child and unmarried by a man who will not acknowledge me, let alone marry me. The best I can hope for is to disappear to some distant town where I might invent a dead husband and live as a widow, though how I shall support myself and a child with no resources, I cannot fathom." "There is another option," Lord Greystone said, and something in his voice made Cordelia look up sharply. "You could marry me." The words hung in the air between them, so absurd that for a moment Cordelia was certain she had misheard, or that Lord Greystone was engaging in some cruel jest at her expense. But his expression remained grave, his gaze steady, and she understood with dawning horror that he was entirely serious. "You cannot mean that," she whispered. "I assure you, I never say anything I do not mean," Lord Greystone replied. "My reasoning is entirely practical, Miss Talbot, so do not imagine this is some romantic gesture. He must safeguard the Sinclair line against utter dishonor, not for Gideon's sake, but for the weight of the marquisate itself. The Sinclair family honor, such as it remains after my cousin's repeated indiscretions, requires that his illegitimate child not be cast into poverty and shame. As the current head of the family in all but name, my uncle being too indulgent and too blind to Gideon's faults, that responsibility falls to me." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression that of a man conducting a business negotiation rather than proposing marriage. "Furthermore," he continued, "I am 34 years old and in need of an heir. I have no interest in the marriage market, no patience for the machinations of ambitious mothers and their simpering daughters. An arrangement such as this, based on practical necessity rather than romantic delusion, suits my temperament perfectly." "You would claim another man's child as your own?" Cordelia asked, struggling to comprehend what he was suggesting. "I would claim the child as mine in law and in name," Lord Greystone clarified. "No one need ever know the circumstances of conception. We shall marry by special license within the week, depart immediately for my estate in Yorkshire, and by the time the child is born, enough time will have passed that any gossip will be easily dismissed. You will have the protection of my name and the security of my fortune. The child will be raised as my heir if it is a boy, or provided for handsomely if it is a girl." "And what would you require of me in return?" Cordelia asked, because surely no man offered such generosity without expecting something in exchange. "Discretion," Lord Greystone said immediately. "Absolute discretion regarding the child's true parentage. Respectable behavior befitting a countess. Management of my household when we are in residence at Greystone Hall. Beyond that, I ask very little. I do not expect affection, Miss Talbot, nor do I offer it. This would be a marriage of convenience in the truest sense of the term." It was the most cold-blooded proposal Cordelia could have imagined, and yet it offered something she had thought forever lost: safety, a future, a name for her child that was not weighted with shame and illegitimacy. "Why?" she asked, needing to understand what would drive a man to such an extraordinary measure. "Surely there are other ways to salvage your family's honor without binding yourself to me for life." "Because Gideon will do this again," Lord Greystone said, and for the first time, genuine emotion crept into his voice. It sounded like disgust mixed with weary resignation. "He will seduce and abandon another young woman, and another, until someone has the spine to make him face consequences. By claiming you and the child publicly as my own, I make it clear to my cousin and to society that the Sinclair family will not tolerate such behavior. It is a message, Miss Talbot, as much as it is a remedy to your situation." Cordelia sat in silence, turning his offer over in her mind, like a stone whose weight and texture she needed to fully understand. It was not the life she had imagined when Gideon first smiled at her across the assembly rooms. It held no romance, no tender declarations, no promise of love, but it offered something far more valuable: survival. Cordelia clasped her hands tightly. "I would require separate chambers," she said finally, testing the boundaries of this strange arrangement. "And I would not expect you to feign affection in private if you feel none." "Agreed," Lord Greystone said without hesitation. "I maintain residences in both Yorkshire and London. You may occupy whichever suits you when we are not required to appear together publicly. I am often away on business regarding my estates. You will find me an undemanding husband in all respects." "Very well," Cordelia heard herself say, the words emerging before she could reconsider the enormity of what she was accepting. "I will marry you, Lord Greystone." He nodded once, as if she had merely agreed to a business arrangement rather than accepting a proposal of marriage, and rose to his feet. "I shall call upon your aunt this afternoon to request your hand formally," he said. "I expect she will be eager to be rid of you, given the circumstances. We shall marry on Friday by special license. I suggest you use the intervening days to prepare whatever you wish to bring to Yorkshire. I shall cover any expenses required." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she could not read. "One more thing, Miss Talbot. When we are in public, you will call me Greystone or my lord, as propriety demands. But in private, you may call me Dominic. It seems absurd to stand on ceremony with someone who will bear my name and live in my house." Then he was gone, leaving Cordelia alone in the private parlor with the remains of her meal, and the stunning realization that in the space of an hour, her entire future had been rewritten by a man who offered her everything except the one thing she had once believed essential to marriage: love. The wedding took place on a cold Friday morning in late November, in a small parish church far from the fashionable areas of Bath, where curious eyes might mark the hasty nature of the proceedings. Cordelia wore the best gown she possessed, a pale gray silk that had belonged to her mother, altered by her own hands to accommodate her expanding waist. There were no flowers, no music beyond the vicar's droning voice, no guests save for 2 servants summoned to serve as witnesses. Dominic stood beside her in his dark coat and immaculate cravat, his expression as remote as if he were attending a particularly tedious business meeting. When the vicar asked if he took Cordelia to be his lawfully wedded wife, his "I do" was firm and clear, a contractual agreement rather than a declaration of devotion. Cordelia's own voice trembled when she spoke her vows, not from emotion, but from the surreal quality of the moment. She was promising to honor and obey a man she barely knew, taking his name to give her unborn child legitimacy, entering into a marriage that both of them understood was a legal fiction designed to solve a practical problem. When Dominic placed the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that nevertheless felt heavy with the weight of all it represented, Cordelia searched his face for some sign of what he was feeling. She found nothing but the same cool composure he had displayed since their conversation in the pump room 3 days prior. The vicar pronounced them man and wife. Dominic did not kiss her. Instead, he offered his arm with perfect courtesy and escorted her from the church to the waiting carriage that would convey them to Yorkshire and her new life as the Countess of Greystone. Her aunt had accepted the marriage with barely concealed relief and greed, extracting from Dominic what Cordelia suspected was a substantial sum, far greater than she could have dreamed, which quieted any remaining concerns she possessed regarding the scandalous circumstances. Mrs. Cavendish had not even bothered to attend the wedding, having made it clear that as far as she was concerned, Cordelia had ceased to be her responsibility the moment Lord Greystone made his offer. The journey north took 3 miserable days, during which Dominic maintained polite but distant conversation on neutral topics: the state of the roads, the weather, the management of his Yorkshire estates. He never once referenced her condition or the circumstances that had led to their marriage. At the inns where they stopped for the night, he secured separate chambers without comment, as if this were the natural arrangement for a newly married couple. Cordelia spent those long hours in the carriage studying her husband's profile, trying to understand the man to whom she had bound herself. He was handsome in a severe way, his features too sharp for softness, his manner too controlled for warmth. She guessed he was perhaps a decade and a half her senior, old enough that the difference in their ages might have raised eyebrows in other circumstances. But what struck her most was his self-containment, the sense that he kept himself locked behind walls no less formidable than the stone battlements of the castles they passed along their route. She wondered what had made him this way, what experiences had taught him to offer practical solutions rather than emotional comfort, to marry a desperate stranger rather than pursue the love matches that men of his station and fortune could easily secure. She did not ask. The terms of their arrangement did not require such intimacy of understanding, and she sensed that Dominic would not welcome probing questions about his inner life. Greystone Hall appeared on the afternoon of their third day of travel, rising from the Yorkshire landscape like something from a storybook. It was not the largest estate Cordelia had seen during their journey, but it possessed a solid, prosperous beauty that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. Gray stone walls weathered by centuries of northern winters, mullioned windows reflecting the pale December sun, and grounds that even in their winter dormancy showed evidence of meticulous care. "It is beautiful," Cordelia said, the first genuine words of admiration she had spoken since leaving Bath. "It has been in my family for 4 generations," Dominic replied, something in his voice suggesting a profound and restrained pride. "I hope you will be comfortable here." The household staff assembled in the entrance hall to receive their new mistress, a line of curious faces trying to conceal their surprise at Lord Greystone's sudden marriage and the youth of his chosen bride. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Bartley, possessed the kind of assessing gaze that Cordelia suspected missed very little, including the slight swell of her new mistress's abdomen. "Welcome to Greystone Hall, my lady," Mrs. Bartley said with a curtsy that was perfectly correct while communicating absolutely nothing about her private thoughts. "Your chambers have been prepared. Perhaps you would like to rest after your journey." "That would be most welcome," Cordelia replied, grateful for the excuse to escape the scrutiny of servants who must be wondering why their master had married so hastily and so far beneath his station. The Countess's chambers occupied the east wing of the house, a suite of rooms that included a bedchamber, dressing room, and small sitting room that overlooked the gardens. They were beautifully appointed, if somewhat old-fashioned in their furnishings, and they were notably separate from the master's chambers, which Mrs. Bartley mentioned occupied the west wing. "Lord Greystone thought you might prefer privacy while you settle in," Mrs. Bartley said, her tone suggesting she found such an arrangement unusual for newlyweds, but was too well trained to comment directly. "He has asked me to provide you with anything you might require. You have only to ring." Left alone in her new chambers, Cordelia sank onto the edge of the bed and allowed herself to absorb the full measure of the transformation her life had undergone. A month ago, she had been a disgraced young woman, with no prospects, and a child growing in her womb that would condemn them both to poverty and shame. Now she was a countess, mistress of a great house, married to a man who had offered her everything except his heart. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the faint flutter of movement that had begun in recent weeks, and made a silent promise to the child she carried. Whatever Dominic felt or did not feel, whatever had motivated his extraordinary offer, she would make herself worthy of the protection he had provided. She would be the Countess Greystone Hall deserved, manage his household with efficiency and grace, and raise her child to understand the debt of honor they owed to the man who had claimed them as his own. It was not love, but perhaps, Cordelia thought as exhaustion pulled her toward sleep in her grand new bed, it might be enough. The winter months at Greystone Hall passed in a strange kind of limbo. Dominic was courteous but distant, appearing at dinner each evening to inquire about her health and her comfort, but otherwise occupying himself with the management of his estates. He spent long hours closeted in his study with his steward, rode out daily to inspect his properties despite the bitter cold, and treated Cordelia with the exact degree of polite consideration he might have shown a valued guest rather than a wife. Cordelia, for her part, applied herself to learning the rhythms of her new household with the determination of someone who understood that competence might earn her the respect affection could not. Mrs. Bartley, initially reserved, began to thaw as Cordelia demonstrated genuine interest in the management of the house and deference to the housekeeper's greater experience. "The previous Lady Greystone passed near on 10 years ago," Mrs. Bartley confided one afternoon, as she and Cordelia reviewed the household accounts together. "His lordship's mother, a fine woman who knew how to run a great house proper. Lord Greystone has managed alone since then, never expressed an interest in marrying until now." The comment was clearly an invitation for Cordelia to explain the suddenness of her marriage, but she had learned enough in her weeks at Greystone Hall to recognize the value of discretion. "I consider myself most fortunate in his lordship's regard," she said simply. and let Mrs. Bartley draw whatever conclusions she wished. As her pregnancy advanced into its final months, Cordelia found herself observing her husband with growing curiosity. There were moments when his careful composure would slip just slightly, revealing depths she had not suspected. He had a particular fondness for the estate's tenants, especially the children, and he could often be found discussing crop rotations or livestock management with a passion that never entered his voice when speaking with her. Once she came upon him in the library late at night, surrounded by ledgers, and saw him rubbing his temples with a weariness that suggested the weight of his responsibilities was more burdensome than he let others see. He had looked up at her entrance with a flash of vulnerability quickly concealed, and had bid her good night with his usual courtesy before she could think of what to say. It was clear to Cordelia that Dominic Sinclair, Earl of Greystone, was a far more complex man than the cold arrangement of their marriage might suggest. But the terms he had set precluded the kind of intimacy that might allow her to understand him better, and she did not feel she had earned the right to cross the boundaries he had established. In March, word came that Dominic's uncle, the Marquis of Wolverhampton, had died suddenly of an apoplexy. The news meant that Dominic now inherited the marquessate in addition to his earldom, an elevation in status that made Cordelia not just a countess, but a marchioness. Dominic received the news with the same controlled composure with which he approached everything else, though Cordelia noticed he spent longer than usual alone in his study that evening, and the amount of brandy in the decanter had decreased considerably when he finally emerged. "This means we shall need to spend part of the year in London," he informed her over dinner the following evening. "There are duties associated with the marquisate that cannot be managed from Yorkshire. However, given your condition, we shall postpone any travel until after you are delivered and recovered." It was the most direct reference he had made to her pregnancy since their wedding, and Cordelia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am at your disposal, my lord," she said quietly. "Whatever arrangement suits you best." Dominic studied her across the table with an expression she could not read. "I trust your comfort is complete, Cordelia, and that you are not finding the duties of Greystone Hall too isolating?" The use of her Christian name startled her, as did the note of what might have been genuine concern in his voice. In the 4 months of their marriage, he had called her "my lady" or occasionally "madam" in the presence of servants, but never simply Cordelia. "Not at all," she replied honestly. "I have always preferred the country to cities, and Mrs. Bartley has been most helpful in teaching me the management of a household of this size." "Good," Dominic said, returning his attention to his meal. "That is good." The conversation ended there, as most of their exchanges did, the silence between them becoming a fixed habit. But something in that brief moment of connection stayed with Cordelia through the weeks that followed, a hint that beneath his controlled exterior, Dominic was not as indifferent to her existence as he might wish to appear. April brought the first real warmth of spring to Yorkshire, and with it, the realization that Cordelia's time was drawing near. The midwife from the village, Mrs. Fletcher, began calling regularly to assess her condition and prepare for the lying-in. Dominic, when informed that the birth might be expected within the month, had merely nodded and suggested Cordelia should have whatever she required for her comfort. She expected him to leave for London or occupy himself with estate business that would keep him far from the birthing chamber when her time came. Gentlemen of his station did not typically involve themselves in such matters, which were considered the exclusive domain of women. But when her pains began on a cool April evening and Mrs. Bartley and Mrs. Fletcher installed her in her chambers with the efficiency of long practice, Cordelia was astonished to learn that Dominic had taken up residence in the small adjoining sitting room that connected their separate suites. "His lordship insists on being nearby," Mrs. Bartley informed her between contractions. "Says he wants to be informed immediately should anything go wrong." "Surely he should not," Cordelia gasped, mortified at the thought of her husband overhearing her cries during what the midwife had warned would be a long and difficult labor. "It is not proper." "Begging your pardon, my lady, but his lordship seems quite firm on the matter," Mrs. Bartley replied, and something in her tone suggested this unprecedented behavior had elevated Dominic in the housekeeper's estimation. The labor lasted through the night and into the following day, a grueling ordeal that tested the limits of Cordelia's endurance. Through it all, she clung to the knowledge that just beyond the door, Dominic waited, his presence a tether keeping her anchored when pain threatened to sweep her away entirely. The child was born just after dawn, a son with a lusty cry that filled the chambers and proclaimed his vigorous health. Mrs. Fletcher placed the squalling bundle in Cordelia's arms, and she looked down at the tiny face, seeing in his features a mix of herself and the man who had fathered him, but would never claim him. Cordelia stared at the miracle in her arms for only a moment before exhaustion claimed her, dragging her down into the darkness of sleep so deep it bordered on unconsciousness. She surfaced some time later to find her chambers transformed into a peaceful haven. The chaos of birth cleaned away, herself washed and dressed in a fresh nightgown, her son sleeping in a cradle by her bedside. Weak sunlight filtered through the curtains, suggesting it was now well into the afternoon. And sitting in the chair beside her bed, holding her sleeping son with a tenderness that made something in Cordelia's chest constrict painfully, was Dominic. He did not notice her waking immediately, too absorbed in studying the child's face with an expression of such fierce, possessive affection that Cordelia felt as if she were intruding on a private moment. When he finally looked up and found her watching, something in his eyes that might have been vulnerability shuddered quickly, replaced by his usual composure. "You are awake," he said quietly, careful not to disturb the child. "Mrs. Fletcher says you did remarkably well, though it was a difficult labor. How do you feel?" "Tired," Cordelia admitted, "but well enough, considering." Dominic looked down at the child in his arms, and when he spoke again, his voice held a note of something Cordelia could not quite identify. "He is beautiful, Cordelia, perfect in every way. I thought we might name him Henry, after my father, if that meets with your approval." The generosity of it, that he would give his own father's name to a child that was not his blood, brought tears to Cordelia's eyes. "Henry is a fine name," she whispered. Dominic rose and carried the child to her, placing him carefully in her arms before stepping back to a respectful distance. But Cordelia had seen the way he held her son, the expression on his face as he gazed at the baby, and she understood with sudden clarity that whatever Dominic felt or did not feel for her, he had already begun to love the child he had claimed as his own. It was the beginning of a transformation so gradual that Cordelia barely perceived it was happening until she looked back weeks later and realized everything had changed. Dominic began visiting the nursery daily, something Mrs. Bartley informed her with barely concealed astonishment was quite unprecedented for a gentleman of his station. He would appear in the afternoon when Henry was most alert, and would spend time simply holding him with increasing confidence as the weeks passed. Cordelia, still recovering from the birth, often joined these visits, and she found that conversation flowed more easily with Henry between them, a shared focus that dissolved some of the awkwardness of their arrangement. Dominic would tell her about the estate business he had conducted that day, or ask her opinion on household matters, and gradually their exchanges began to feel less like polite necessities and more like genuine communication between two people learning to share a life. One afternoon in May, Cordelia arrived at the nursery to find Dominic pacing with Henry in his arms, the baby fussing. "He has been crying for the past quarter hour," Dominic said, looking uncharacteristically helpless. "I have tried everything Mrs. Bartley suggested, but nothing seems to comfort him." Cordelia took Henry and immediately felt the heat radiating from his small body. Her heart lurched with sudden fear as she pressed her hand to his forehead, finding him burning with fever. "He is ill," she said, trying to keep panic from her voice. "We must send for the physician immediately." What followed was 3 days of the most acute terror Cordelia had ever experienced. Young Henry's fever climbed dangerously high, bringing with it the threat of the many ailments that claimed infants. The physician, Dr. Morrison, diagnosed an inflammation of the lungs and prescribed treatments that seemed to do little to break the fever's grip. Cordelia refused to leave Henry's side, sitting by his cradle through day and night, bathing his small body with cool cloths and praying to any deity who might listen that he would be spared. And to her astonishment, Dominic joined her vigil, taking up residence in the nursery's adjoining room and spelling her when exhaustion threatened to overcome her completely. "You should rest," he told her on the second night, his voice rough with worry and lack of sleep. "I will watch over him." "I cannot," Cordelia replied. "What if he worsens and I am not here?" "Then you will be here because I shall wake you immediately," Dominic said firmly. "But you are no good to him if you collapse from exhaustion. Please, Cordelia, trust me to care for him while you sleep." It was the first time he had asked anything of her beyond the terms of their original arrangement, and the plea in his voice broke down the last of her resistance. She allowed him to guide her to her chambers, to tuck a blanket around her as she lay on the bed, too exhausted to even remove her day dress. She surfaced a few hours later to find dawn breaking and Dominic standing in her doorway, his face transformed by relief so profound it made him look younger, almost vulnerable. "The fever broke an hour ago," he said. "Henry is sleeping peacefully. Dr. Morrison believes the worst is past." Cordelia flew from the bed and rushed to the nursery, needing to see with her own eyes that her son lived and would recover. She found Henry sleeping as Dominic had said, his small body cool to the touch, his breathing easier. She sank into the chair beside his cradle and wept, all the terror and exhaustion of the past days pouring out in great, shuddering sobs. She felt Dominic's hand on her shoulder, tentative at first, then firmer as he squeezed gently. "He will be well," Dominic said quietly. "He is strong, our Henry." Our Henry. The words hung in the air between them, a claim that went beyond legal fiction into something far more real. Cordelia looked up at her husband, seeing him properly for perhaps the first time since their marriage. His hair was disheveled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, his cravat long since discarded. He looked nothing like the controlled, composed man who had proposed a marriage of convenience in a bath parlor 6 months ago. "I could not have endured this alone," she whispered. "Thank you, Dominic, for everything." He crouched beside her chair so they were at eye level, and when he spoke, his voice held an intensity that made her heart race. "I can no longer pretend, Cordelia. I thought I could maintain the distance I promised, treat this as merely a practical arrangement. But from the moment I held Henry in my arms, from the moment I saw you lying there after bringing him into this world, I understood that I had been lying to myself about what this marriage could be." He took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "I do not expect you to return my feelings," he continued, words tumbling out as if long dammed. "I know I have given you no reason to care for me beyond gratitude for rescuing you from an impossible situation. But I find I can no longer pretend indifference when the truth is that I love you, Cordelia. I love you and our son with everything I am, and I can no longer keep that truth locked away." Cordelia stared at him, her mind struggling to process this sudden reversal. The man who had married her without emotion, who had maintained rigid distance, who had treated their union as a business arrangement, was confessing love with a fervor that took her breath away. "When?" she managed to ask. "When did you know?" "The first time I held Henry," Dominic said without hesitation. "I looked at him, and I looked at you sleeping in that bed, exhausted from bringing new life into the world, and I realized that I would give anything, sacrifice everything, to keep you both safe and happy. The feeling has only grown stronger with each day since." Cordelia felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but these were not tears of fear or exhaustion. She thought of the past months, of Dominic's constant presence in the nursery, of the way he looked at Henry with such tenderness, of his vigil through their son's illness. She thought of small moments she had not allowed herself to examine too closely. The way his eyes would linger on her face sometimes when he thought she was not looking. The care with which he ensured her comfort, even while maintaining the distance he believed she required. "My dear, you are utterly foolish," she said. "Did you never think to ask me how I felt?" Dominic's expression shifted to something that might have been hope. "I assumed your feelings remained with Gideon," he said carefully. "That you saw me as merely the man who had saved you from the consequences of loving another." "Gideon?" Cordelia shook her head. "Whatever I felt for him died the moment his butler informed me he had fled to the continent. No, whatever affection I once imagined I held was nothing more than the desperate hope of a girl who believed herself unwanted. I mourned not the loss of Gideon Sinclair, but the loss of the future I thought his pretty words had promised." She stood, still holding Dominic's hand, pulling him to his feet so they faced each other fully. "You want to know when I knew I loved you?" she asked. "It was the day you first held Henry, when I woke to find you sitting beside my bed with our son in your arms. The way you looked at him, the tenderness in your expression, told me everything I needed to know about the man you truly are beneath that careful composure. And I have loved you more with each passing day, even as I believed you felt nothing for me beyond dutiful responsibility." The joy that transformed Dominic's face was extraordinary to witness. He pulled her into his arms with a fervor that spoke of months of restraint finally breaking, and when he kissed her, it held all the passion and devotion their wedding kiss had lacked. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. "We have been remarkably foolish," he said. "Remarkably," Cordelia agreed, and then she laughed, the sound bright with relief and happiness. "Shall we agree to be less foolish going forward?" "I believe that can be arranged," Dominic replied, and kissed her again. The summer that followed marked the true beginning of their marriage. Dominic moved his belongings to the master's chambers that adjoined Cordelia's own, and the connecting door between them remained open. They spent long evenings together after Henry had been settled for the night, talking about everything from estate management to literature to their childhoods, learning each other with the careful attention of people who had been given an unexpected second chance. In June, a letter arrived that would explain much about Dominic's reaction to Gideon's behavior and his willingness to claim another man's child. It came from Italy, from Gideon himself, a missive so casually cruel in its contents that Cordelia felt sick reading it. "My dear cousin," it began, dripping with false affection, "I hear you have taken a wife. I do hope it is not that pretty little fool from Bath, the one I told you about in my last letter. I trust you remember my amusing description of her. How eager she was to believe my every word, how easily she surrendered to my promises. Surely even you would not be so desperate as to marry my cast-off plaything." Dominic read the letter with no visible emotion, though Cordelia saw his jaw tighten with anger held in rigid check. "He wrote to you about me?" she asked, her voice small. "Before we married?" "He did," Dominic confirmed. "He sent a letter from France boasting of his conquest, calling you a foolish girl who had practically thrown herself at him. He seemed to think I would find his behavior amusing. And what did you do?" "I wrote to my uncle and informed him that Gideon was permanently banned from all Sinclair family properties, and that his allowance was to be ceased immediately," Dominic said flatly. "I also made it clear that should Gideon ever return to England, he would find every door in society closed to him. My uncle, to his credit, agreed, though I suspect he saw it more as protecting the family name than holding Gideon accountable for his actions." He took Cordelia's hands in his expression fierce. "I want you to understand something, Cordelia. When I found you in the pump room that day, I knew exactly who you were and what Gideon had done to you. I had been searching for you since receiving his letter, hoping to offer assistance before your situation became desperate. Finding you the way I did, ill and clearly with child, made me realize that assistance alone would not be enough. You needed protection, a name, security. and I needed to make absolutely clear to my cousin and to anyone else who might follow his example that such behavior would not be tolerated. "So you married me to punish your cousin?" Cordelia asked, needing to understand. "I married you because it was the right thing to do," Dominic corrected. "The punishment to Gideon was a consequence, not the motivation. Though I confess I did not anticipate that the marriage I entered into for duty and honor would become the greatest blessing of my life." In September, word reached them that Gideon had been killed in a duel in Rome, shot by the brother of yet another young woman he had seduced and abandoned. Dominic received the news with complex emotions that he did not try to hide from Cordelia. Grief for the cousin he had known in childhood, anger at the waste of a life, and a grim satisfaction that Gideon had finally faced consequences for his actions. "I cannot mourn him as I should," Dominic admitted as they sat together in the library that evening. "He was family, and yet his death feels like justice delayed rather than tragedy." "You need not apologize for your feelings," Cordelia said gently. "He caused great harm in his life. That you feel conflicted speaks to your character, not to any failing in your response." A few weeks later, another consequence of Gideon's behavior arrived at Greystone Hall in the form of a desperate letter from a young woman in London who claimed to be carrying Gideon's child and had nowhere to turn. She had heard through servants' gossip that Lord Greystone had dealt honorably with a similar situation and was writing in hope rather than expectation. Cordelia watched Dominic read the letter, saw the set of his jaw that indicated he was preparing to take action. "You will help her," she said. It was not a question. "If you do not object," Dominic replied, "I cannot in good conscience leave her to the fate that would have been yours had we not met." "Then we shall help her together," Cordelia said firmly, "as we should have helped any others Gideon harmed had we known of them sooner." They arranged for the young woman, Miss Caroline Hartley, to be installed in a cottage on the Greystone estate with a small pension and the fiction of being a distant relation. When her child was born, Dominic ensured that both mother and baby were provided for and helped Miss Hartley eventually find respectable employment as a governess through connections in London. It was the first of what would become many quiet acts of charity, helping women whom society had condemned through no fault of their own, providing second chances that the rigid rules of their world typically denied. 5 years passed with the measured grace of contentment. Greystone Hall saw the births of 3 more children, each pregnancy confirming what Henry's arrival had begun. That the marriage Dominic and Cordelia had entered into from necessity had transformed into something neither had dared hope for. Henry grew into a bright, inquisitive boy who possessed Cordelia's warmth and Dominic's steady character, with none of Gideon's charm or cruelty. His 3 younger siblings adored him, and he accepted the responsibility of being the heir with a seriousness that made both his parents smile. Cordelia had blossomed into her role as Marchioness of Wolverhampton, dividing their time between Greystone Hall and their London residence with an ease that suggested she had been born to such a position. She was respected by the household staff, admired by society for her charitable works, and loved by her husband with a devotion that had only deepened with time. The fund they established for women in difficult circumstances helped hundreds over the years, providing assistance with discretion to those whom society would have condemned. They never spoke publicly of why this cause was so important to them, but those who benefited from their generosity understood that the Marquess and Marchioness of Wolverhampton knew personally what it meant to need help when the world had turned its back. On a warm June afternoon, Dominic and Cordelia sat together in the gardens at Greystone Hall, watching their children play among the roses. Henry, now nearly 6, was attempting to teach his younger brother the proper way to catch butterflies, a pursuit Cordelia had introduced them to as part of her belief that even the smallest creatures deserved gentle treatment. "Do you ever regret it?" Dominic asked suddenly, his hand finding Cordelia's where it rested on the garden bench between them. "The life you might have had if Gideon had honored his promises?" Cordelia turned to look at her husband, seeing in his face the man she had come to love more than she had known was possible. She thought of the girl she had been in Bath, desperate and afraid, believing herself ruined beyond redemption. She thought of the cold arrangement they had entered into, each believing the other could never care. And she thought of the family they had built together, founded not on the passionate delusions of youth, but on the steady, growing devotion of two people who had chosen each other again and again, every day. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "Gideon Sinclair gave me Henry, and for that I am grateful. But you gave me everything else, your name, your protection, your love, and our family. You showed me that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to accept it, and that the truest love is not the one that sweeps you away, but the one that builds you a home." Dominic raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that still made her heart race after 5 years of marriage. "You have made me happier than I ever imagined possible," he said quietly. "I thought I was rescuing you that day in Bath, but the truth is, you rescued me right back. You taught me that walls I built to protect myself were actually preventing me from living fully. You gave me a family, a purpose beyond duty, and a love I never dared hope to find." "We rescued each other," Cordelia replied, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched their children play. "And we built something far better than either of us could have created alone." Years later, when Henry was grown and preparing to take on the responsibilities of the estate, Dominic would offer to tell him the truth of his parentage. They had decided early on that when Henry reached his majority, he should have the choice to know the full story of his origins. But Henry, after listening to the tale with thoughtful attention, simply shook his head. "Parentage is a matter of honor and legal claim, Father," he said, using the title he had called Dominic since he first learned to speak. "You are my father in every way that matters. You raised me, taught me, loved me, and showed me through your actions what it means to be a man of honor. Whatever circumstances brought me into this family, you chose to claim me as your son. That choice, renewed every day of my life, makes you my father far more than any accident of conception." It was a perspective shaped by the love he had been shown, by parents who had taught him that families were built on choice and devotion rather than merely blood and obligation. And it was a testament to the truth that Dominic and Cordelia had learned in their own journey, that the strongest bonds are forged not in passion's first flame, but in the steady warmth of choosing each other day after day through all the years that follow. In the gardens at Greystone Hall, where Cordelia had once taught her children that even the smallest, most fragile things deserved care and protection, roses bloomed year after year. Each spring brought new life, each summer deepened the colors, and each autumn prepared for renewal. It was a natural rhythm of life and repose, of patient tending yielding beauty far greater than any single moment could capture. And in that garden, beneath the Yorkshire sky that had witnessed their unlikely union, the family Dominic and Cordelia had built together continued to flourish, a testament to the fact that the greatest love stories are not about falling, but about building, and not about rescue, but about partnership. Henry would carry forward the lessons his parents had taught him, would one day establish his own charitable works to help those society deemed unworthy of second chances. He would remember always that he had been born into shame and raised in love, and that the man who chose to be his father had given him the greatest gift possible. The understanding that honor comes not from the circumstances of one's birth, but from the choices one makes every day thereafter. And so the legacy continued, generation after generation, a testament to the truth that Cordelia and Dominic had learned through pain and joy alike, that love, real love, is not about grand gestures or perfect beginnings. It is about showing up day after day, choosing commitment over convenience, building something lasting from whatever materials fate provides, and having the courage to believe that redemption is possible even in the darkest of circumstances. The story that began with abandonment and desperation had forged something far more beautiful. A family bound not by obligation, but by choice, a love that grew stronger through adversity, and a home where second chances were not just given, but celebrated as the very foundation of everything they had built together. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and hope.